is funded by viewers like you. Support our independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. Nina Burleigh is writing an incredible book that comes out in May called Virus, which is available right now as a pre-order.
I got into this because I'm writing these essays about really to try to explain and cut through the fog of what we just went through. So part of the book is about the almost criminal Trump regime response to it in the way the public policy, the handling of it in the United States, and then the amazing triumph of science in creating this vaccine in a year, and we discount the advances of science. And so I come to this as a big fan of science. And there's a chapter or an essay about the crazy conspiracy theories that sort of erupted around COVID, right? COVID hoax, it's just the flu. And if you went on Reddit, you would see, oh, it's the Kung flu and Bill Gates is behind it and it's a population control virus, and which is so ridiculous because Bill Gates has vaccinated millions of African children and actually had the opposite effect on the population than what they're saying he's going to have. But then I got to the lab leak theory, and I didn't know as much about it. I read Nicholson Baker's article, and I thought, this sounds interesting. And then I got more involved, and I interviewed Dr. David Relman at Stanford, who you may know is a microbiologist and who is open, one of the few American, top level scientists in America, virologist, who is talking about this. And I think what happened was under Trump, I just should call him the last guy. Under the last guy, you couldn't talk about these things because we had this issue with their xenophobic lunacy, and also because they were pushing all these conspiracy theories, including COVID as a hoax, and QAnon was erupting. And so nobody really wanted to get on board. But once you started to look into it, all of the things that you've said, there were other researchers who were talking about that quite early on, and they were immediately silenced. When Redfield says science will figure it out, honestly, I think it'll be one of those things where 100 years from now, they'll still be saying, it was probably a lab leak. But the scientists are never going to admit. Would you admit if something escaped from your lab that killed millions of people? There's never going to admit it. So I don't understand. I'm not sure that we're ever going to get to the bottom of it. I did think it was interesting in mid-March, one of those WHO team members, just a tiny blip on NBC. I think I sent it to you, Zev, a minute or two ago. A little tiny story. One of the members of the team says to NBC, yeah, we know that some of those Wuhan virologists were sick in the fall. And then you never saw anything about that story again. I've been looking for it because there's the smoking gun, right? They got sick.
In fact, they denied that they were sick. Especially in the WHO report, they denied that there was any sickness at the Institute of Virology.
Now it's obliterated. So it's up to the science community to come around, and science is so advanced, the vaccine and this genetic platform that they've come up with, the fact that within 200 years ago, humans were utterly helpless against every single kind of infectious disease, literally helpless, except for the smallpox vaccine. And then at the beginning of the 19th or 20th century, the lifespan of Americans was 48 and 49, the average lifespan. And now it's 78 and 79. Why? Because of vaccinations, childhood vaccinations. If you were born in 1900, you would have never gotten to be 20 or 25 years old without knowing a sibling or another child who died or who had absolutely traumatic illnesses, the names of which we can't even pronounce. And we are so spoiled by these vaccines that we can walk around. We have half the country going, you think you know better than I do? I'll just DIY it on the internet. I don't think I'm going to vaccinate my kid for measles. I'm not going to take the COVID. We know EMTs up here and nursing home staff who have said no, they don't want it. So we know better than the experts. It's part of the current cultural moment. But there is another reason why people are suspicious, and it has to do with, we know anybody who grew up in the baby boom or Gen X and was even half paying attention to the culture, that there was a lot of bad science done by our own scientists, and it's all secret. They were doing bioweapons research at Fort Detrick. One of the Nicholson-Baker FOIAs has to do with this wheat-killing disease that our American scientists were working on so they could drop it on the Soviets and starve the army. And instead it got loose, and they had 20 Midwestern states lost their crops for 2 years. This is all forgotten history from the 1950s. MK Ultra, acid experiment, LSD experiments. Scott Olson was at Fort Detrick. Scott Olson was working on Korean germ warfare. And so we know that was something that the American scientists were working on. And I think that is really the bottom, at the foundation of this kind of QAnon mania, because people know about it. And so here we are with this worldwide, and it's just so bad for science that they've done so many great things that they can't, and I don't know what the answer is. I'm not in your profession. I mean, I think like David Relman at Stanford, if more people would come out and say, it's quite possible that this is an accident, then they would have to come back and make some changes, because, we're lucky, as Zeynep Tufek chief says, this is a starter pandemic. It could have been much worse. It could be 50% fatal.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. And I think what people fail to see is that we shouldn't stop the science, even at the Wuhan, but what we have to recognize the risks. And we can't have the research occurring under a regime where they hid the truth from the world, if we're being totally frank about this, of the original outbreak. And even the WHO have come out and admitted that to an extent they were deceived by the Chinese in terms of the seriousness of this outbreak back in December and early January. They were told there was no person-to-person transmission. We now have doctors in Wuhan saying, we were telling the authorities, in mid-December, this was clearly human-to-human transmission, a respiratory virus. They should be shutting everything down. That narrative didn't get out to the rest of the world. It was shut down by the Chinese authorities. We have a pandemic now, not because we had the Wuhan Institute of Virology during research, or even that they had a lab leak, but an environment where they had a lab leak and then they tried to hide it. And that's where the real problem starts, is not that you might have a lab leak, but if you then hide the outbreak from the world, and also internally in China, long enough for that virus to spread and get out, then you are responsible for the pandemic. So it's not the laboratory error, I believe, if that's what triggered this, that really is at fault. It was the environment of the suppression of the doctors who were trying to warn the world from China in December, look, this is another SARS, you've got to shut everything down. And that didn't happen, and that is inexcusable.
That's very true. And of course, the cover-up may be continuing today, because as we found out from the World Health Organization investigation, when the investigators were sent over there for a visit, we assumed, or at least I assumed, it was going to be one of these investigations where they could look at everything. They'd certainly have access to all the facilities or any research or anything. That's not really the way it was designed. As it turns out, they were given a framework that they could work within. And that, in fact, it was a investigation that is now at least being referred to as a joint investigation between China and the World Health Organization. Ultimately, they did get a chance to at least consider whether it was a virus that came out of a lab. And so the four outcomes that they come out with are: there's a direct zoonotic spillover is considered to be a possible to likely pathway. And then introduction through an intermediate host is considered to be likely to a very likely pathway. An introduction through cold food chain products, which is basically that frozen food somehow infected people in Wuhan, and that food became the origin of the outbreak. They consider that still a possible pathway. And then the last thing they say is introduction through laboratory incident, which is what we're discussing here today, was considered to be extremely unlikely. However, when you actually look at the fine print, they said basically that the laboratory incident as an accident was possible but not likely, but a deliberate bioengineering is still possible because they never even studied that.
So I think that we have to realize that this was a goodwill mission. Calling it, even the group who went into China have now said, don't call this an investigation. So this was a goodwill mission trying to establish ties between WHO and China. And the agreed mission was for this group, a panel of experts, to review the Chinese data. So in other words, the data that the Chinese had collected, this group was to review that data and comment on it.
Right.
It wasn't to go anywhere outside of that and start asking their own questions or investigating their own hypotheses. So it was never an investigation. And in fact, today, I notice most of the Western world governments have put out an official statement. This is a collective of the US, Australian, Canadian, and a number of the UK, European countries have put out an official statement saying that they are seriously concerned with the WHO report. And I'm reassured that not everyone is falling for this narrative, that this was an independent investigation that was going to go in and have access to everything and come to a conclusive decision. It was, as I say, a goodwill joint mission between WHO and China, where 50% of the members of the panel were Chinese. They had a right to veto of any decisions, obviously had a very strong voice in what was in the narrative that was in that report. And now we have most Western governments saying, don't take that report verbatim as if it was an independent report that was really empowered to go to the bottom of where did this virus come from. And I think it's very reassuring that statement has been put out.
And this is after the United States actually, I think, made them rewrite it. If you listen carefully to what the White House said yesterday in the press conference, they said that they were encouraged that the report had been rewritten. So presumably it was even more supportive of the Chinese findings than it now reads. But even now, it's disturbing. And you've got, besides the fact that they've added in all these elements to say it's a joint WHO-China study and it says joint report and then acknowledges that, it doesn't seem to recognize all the possibilities and rank them very fairly. And then what I also found interesting, we mentioned the two people earlier, Peter Daszak and Zhengji Shi, I think. Look, he was on the committee that went there for the WHO. He was the only American representative who went on this investigative trip to Wuhan and China. And she is the person who was handling all the pathogen identification. There also need to be looked at in a very different light, considering he funded the facility and Zhengji Shi was the person in charge of the research.
Yes, look, that's certainly an issue of independence. And not only that, not only is Peter obviously not independent and has major conflicts, but he's been extremely vocal, in fact, voicing the opinion for the whole panel even before the official report was made public. He was commenting, this is what I'm going to say in the report, clearly indicating he was the dominant voice of the Western members of this panel, which, is even more inappropriate. It's inappropriate to have someone who's conflicted and not independent. It's even more inappropriate when you allow that person to actually control the decision-making and the wording of what's released out of that report. It's really disappointing, I think, in that context.
Well, I was just going to comment that, and you've alluded to it, that money that he was putting into, that Daszak was putting into the Wuhan system was American government money. And he was getting Pentagon funding or DTRA funding, what is it called, Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And it's all very murky stuff. And he had been, I know, soliciting money from private donors in New York for a while, but he also had this thing going on with the pipeline with the U.S. government that was putting money into the Batcave in China. He was working with her. The thing I wanted to ask Nick is whether or not, I read, and I don't know if this is something that you looked into, that the Chinese, that Xi Zhengli actually had, that institute had the largest database on bat coronaviruses in the world, and that database was taken down. I think Nicholson Baker reports this. It was taken down like right after the pandemic really started to fly around.
Nick mentioned that earlier, yeah.
And did he mention it? Sorry, I missed that. Yeah, and
No
I mean
worries.
what could be more suspicious than that? Oh, it's a national security issue for the Chinese. So I don't know. My only other comment would be, look, again, I write about government policy and global affairs here. If the Chinese government is forced to admit that they did, that this happened, you have to imagine that their government will collapse. My sources in Washington who work in this sort of intelligence community are very concerned that, to have to admit this really puts the U.S. also in a very tricky position, because especially if it was some kind of a bioweapon, which, of course, the Bannon jumped on that right away. That's another reason why everybody's like, no, it's not a bioweapon. It was an accident. Let's just put the benign spin on it. It's an accident. Our own, again, going back to our own secret bioweapons programs, many scientists worked on bioweapons in Fort Detrick, thousands. During the Cold War ended, and that program was reduced. 9/11 happened, and what happened? They started throwing millions and millions of dollars into more bioweapon defense research. Okay, so these bioweapon defense research included, again, whenever you have these tsunamis of defense money, right after 9/11, somebody got rich scamming off anthrax vaccines. This country ramped up. It's under NIH and under NIAID, they were ramping up this biodefense project because after 9/11, national security, just oceans of money were flowing in. And that project, that kind of a project, was destabilizes the world balance in terms of defense. So maybe the Chinese were starting to do their own biodefense experiments. We know the Japanese were. I mean,
they've been doing it all for centuries. Go back to the opium wars. This has been a factor in Chinese history all along. But more than just being a factor in Chinese history, this has been part of their defense strategy. And spoken about and written about defense strategy of the Chinese for a long time now. That bioengineering is part of their warfare program. So it's not unthinkable that they were somehow developing a bioweapon. And in fact, we know that the Obama administration were the ones to freeze the funding on Zheng Jieqi when she was in 2015. And it was the Trump, they froze it all.
They were freezing that gain of function stuff.
Right, exactly.
That's what they did, because there is not agreement in the virology world, and Nick can probably talk to this. There is not agreement that's such a great thing, that they should be doing that in the labs. Many scientists think that's not a good idea, and it's not making us safer. And so somebody got the Obama administration regime's ear, and they said, yeah, let's stop that. And there were people here who were complaining about it. Ralph Barrick in North Carolina, a very prominent gain-of-function experimenter, still on the record, hey, it's a great thing. You just stopped these great experiments. Meanwhile, they have refrigerators full of vials of these viruses that, as you described this one, it's been taught to like human flesh or human cells. And we really are living in a very strange world. And, again, science's advances, I hail them in my book. And I think that we don't think about them enough and appreciate them enough for the way they've changed our society and our life and our lifespans. But this stuff it's due for a reckoning and a rethinking before it really gets out of control. And I don't know if there's anybody having that conversation. At least people are talking about it a little bit more. But
certainly, if they restarted the funding, they should. Because I think in 2019 they did restart the funding, and maybe it wasn't specifically so that was under Trump that they decided. Even though in 2015 they determined that this was dangerous to the world, it could start a pandemic. In 2019 they decided to restart it under Trump. And then a year later, he decides to pull out all the facilities we had there to detect pandemic research and to respond to pandemic research, which is also just another, can of worms to open up. Noel, I've been speaking a lot, and Nina and Nick haven't. I'm sorry, haven't had a chance to let you in here. But what are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
My head feels like it's going to explode. It's an important show. And Nina just laid it out. Like, we have to have this conversation. And her book is fascinating. Like, I'm going to buy a copy for everybody I know, because it's really I got a sneak peek at it, Nina. And if people think this is going to be like a weighty science thing, it's not. Like, the facts are in there and you're going to learn a ton, but it reads like a thriller. You're just like, you literally can't put it down. I started it in 2 places and was jumping through, because you're like, oh my God, because this was almost the perfect storm of so many things. And Nina lays it out in her book. The ignorance that Trump had cultivated and exploited in this country made the COVID virus that much more effective, because people wouldn't wear masks. They won't get vaccinated now. So it was almost the perfect virus at the perfect time in history.
Right.
It was like a modern plague because we have a dark age mentality and high-tech biowarfare, if it is that, or bioengineering. And the confluence of those two things can't be overlooked, and it can't be ignored. And if it is ignored, it'll be at our peril. And we've just gotten a taste this year of that, and it's been horrific. But this could be just the beginning. So it's terrifying and important stuff.
Go for it.
And also having this discussion, just because what's going on in our country right now is no way impugning the people in China or Asian Americans. Like having this discussion does not mean we're in any way like endorsing any kind of hate crimes. Asian Americans help build this country. They're as much a part of this country as are the Chinese people. We're talking about science here and not reactionary xenophobia. I just want to make that
right.
So the Chinese people have also been victims of this regime and its actions, and in fact are still currently under that victimhood. This is in no way should be construed as us suggesting that that the studies or anything suggests that this has anything to do with people of Asian American origin or Asian origin, because it just is not the case. This is about the regime in China. It is about Xi and the Beijing regime.
Look, I entirely agree. It was Chinese scientists who originally actually said this may have been a lab leak. It was Chinese doctors who tried to alert the world that there was a serious pandemic on. And the sad thing is the guy who blew the whistle died of COVID as a young ophthalmologist after having been suppressed and hauled in and locked up by the Chinese authorities. They've now made him a hero posthumously because they had to, because the Chinese people were incensed by this. But the politics remains the same. And so, of course, they're trying to change the narrative, but there are an enormous number of fabulous doctors and scientists in China who I'm sure are equally concerned about how this virus came about. The question is, do they have a voice under the current system? So, yes, this shouldn't be anything about xenophobia against the Chinese people. They're a fabulous people and, they're part of the world community. But we still need to get to the bottom of how this all happened. How do we avoid it happening again?
What do you make of the idea that they described that they did not investigate any bioengineering or any deliberate bioengineering of the coronavirus? And we spoke a little bit while you were off there about that it's not unusual for countries to have biowarfare. Yes, everyone's leaning towards this idea that it might be accidental, but what if it wasn't accidental? What if it was a bioengineering event? Is it possible that's what it was? Is that still likely out there?
Yes, look, I think we have to separate bioengineering from bioweapons. Everything we do in our lab and every other lab in the world now is bioengineering. All our vaccines are created by bioengineering. It's one of the fabulous breakthroughs of the 20th century is our ability to manipulate the genomes, whether it's of a virus or making a drug or a vaccine. So bioengineering is legitimate. We shouldn't in any way infringe or restrict that, because that's where all the great drugs of the future are going to come from, like gene therapy. It's a revolution and it's amazingly positive. As I think Nina was pointing out, science is going to deliver amazing things going forward. And we shouldn't block science and go back to the cave. And that is not the
no one's
solution
suggesting that.
To this or to global warming or anything. No, but because I think there is an ideology out there that science has created these problems and therefore let's shut down science. And there is a large anti-science community, let's be honest, in the United States particularly. And unfortunately, the previous president seemed to give encouragement to those anti-scientists. So we don't want to turn this into an anti-science debate. And I think Nina rightly pointed out, science provides the solutions. Occasionally, science will something will go wrong. And yes, we need to try and reduce the risk of that, but we can't totally avoid it, but we have to manage it. But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Science is essential to humanity going forward. We should encourage it. But yes, when it goes wrong, we should be honest and admit to it. But as I say, not allow that to encourage people who are anti-science or anti-vaccines or anti-everything else.
But what about, is it possible that this thing is a bioweapon, or was deliberately released, I should say? Maybe that's a better way of discussing it.
There's no way to know, but I
No,
would
look,
say,
I
no,
don't.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't think you should even go there. I think that's why the Trump, that's why people wouldn't talk about this during that period, because that's what they were afraid of.
I understand what you're saying, but I just want to know if it's within the realm of possibilities from the science that we've assessed so far. Is a bioweapon still a possibility, and is a deliberate release still a possibility in the science?
No, absolutely.
Presumably, if you were caught, yes. But let's just, we'll leave it at that. That's fine.
Look, there's so many things about this that says that if someone did it in that, they weren't very competent. It's not designed in a way that would function as a bioweapon. It's terrible, but it doesn't kill everyone. And of course, if you're going to release it, you'd have a vaccine and you'd immunize your whole population before you released such a monster. So no, I think we can totally discredit that possibility.
What do you think is the likelihood, Nick, that we find out given the atmosphere that you see in the science world, that we find out, or that more scientists start to come together behind you and people like David Relman at Stanford? Do you think that there will come a consensus? I mean, are you sensing that among your colleagues, that there will come a consensus where people will begin to say, let's talk about this?
Look, absolutely. I think it was very tough last year to talk about this, and there was a lot of pushback. I think as time has gone by and more scientists have joined in from all around the world, we now talk regularly to people in Europe, the US, Hong Kong, even people in China. So I think that, yes, more and more people will be brave and will look at the data and make their own conclusions, which I think there is a lot of evidence out there if people want to see it as to why it might be a lab leak. Similarly, I think I think this would bring down the Chinese regime. They have an amazing ability. If they sense the writings on the wall and the global science community is going to come out with a consensus that this really was a lab leak, then the central government, just as they did with the suppression of the information at the beginning of this pandemic, they just sacked the local officials and held them accountable. And similarly, they would take fairly extreme action against the local people involved and absolve themselves of knowledge or responsibility. So I think they've shown that they can actually admit to an error and wear it and get away with it in that sense. So I think if they do sense the scientific community has moved very much in that direction and they can't really hold ground against it, I'm confident the Chinese government will actually flip. And again, in their discussions, they've never excluded the possibility themselves. So when you look at the fine print, they've always left it there as the lab leak. They're not saying remove that completely. I think they're leaving themselves an out there if they have to.
I think that's very astute, and I think that's exactly what we might see at the end of the day, because the scientific community has shifted. It's clear, just since May last year when I first published my story and did my podcast, to now we've seen a giant shift in this possibility, and certainly the Biden government has not disputed any of this. It's not like they came out and said, oh, what Trump was saying was nonsense. In fact, they've done essentially the opposite by not disputing anything. There was a big fact sheet that came out from the State Department in the last week of the Trump administration, which laid out all these facts, and people disputed it because it was the Trump administration. The Biden administration has not come out and said that is wrong or incorrect. In fact, by their silence, they're saying it is correct. And then we also saw Blinken, the Secretary of State, also say that he has some concerns about the methodology of the WHO study. And then we heard the White House also say that they had asked for some rewriting of this WHO report, which means there is a giant shift going on. So really, it's now in China's court. Are they going to act in this way you've suggested, where they say, yes, we were wrong. Maybe there was something we've discovered since, and it was a lab leak. Now, that does not, help them, maybe domestically they can control that. In terms of their foreign expansion, it's certainly, and their new influence campaign, to influence the world, it would certainly take away from all of that, because they've been using the vaccination and other responses to the coronavirus as a way to influence, boost themselves around the world. That would have to go. That's clearly would hurt them on a foreign relations kind of way. But in terms of the domestic crowd, they could manage it that way. They could manage it by saying, we've discovered something and we now know that it was a leak. That's certainly a possibility. possibility.
I was just watching the Adam Curtis documentaries. I don't know if anybody has seen any of them. They're amazing. I can't get you out of my head. This amazing BBC footage that he weaves together. And a lot of it is in China during the Cultural Revolution. I highly recommend people watch this. It's mesmerizing about our recent history as humans on this planet. But there's a lot of, the Chinese, the government was in the 1960s was, innocent people were trotted out and sent to jail. I mean, this is how it works. I mean, people disappear. I mean, there's Wen Liang, who was the guy you talked about who died, the ophthalmologist who was the whistleblower in that hospital in Wuhan who died, was actually tipped off to the problem by an earlier WeChat conversation by a woman, the head of the ER department in Wuhan named Ai Fen. And Ai Fen, the second or third month of the pandemic, was interviewed by China's version of People magazine, who knew that they had something like that. And she told this story of how she started to notice, this is very, very contagious. And within a week, the doctors were getting sick and the nurses were falling. And she put out on WeChat to her colleagues, this looks like SARS and it looks a lot more dangerous. The next morning, she came into work and they said that she was called into the office and told, don't ever put that onto WeChat. You're making us look bad. You're making your city look bad. And furthermore, keep your mouth shut and put your head down and keep working. And then she went on in silence. And this Wen Liang is the one who then took that and went out with it further. She wrote this piece, ran in whatever this version of People magazine is. It was immediately taken down by the Chinese government, and the Chinese people tried to get around it, translated it into all of these obscure languages, including like some language from Lord of the Rings or something. I mean, unbelievable. And it has been it was printed in Harper's Quarterly. What, not Harper's, Lewis Lapham's Quarterly. Yeah, they printed it in full last summer, so you can still see it, but it's not online. As far as I know, those are the lengths that the Chinese people will go towards trying to get their own story out. And this woman has been silenced. I mean, she's not been seen since. So I agree. I think that they would, if they had to, they would just trot some people out and say, you did this terrible mistake. Shame on you. Shame on your family. Shame on your ancestors, or whatever it is. And that's it. And then they would attempt to go forward. I don't know if there would be I don't know enough about Chinese politics to know, or Chinese, the society. I'm not, whether there would be a kind of a response and a rebellion against that government. I don't know. They have, and one of the things I write about is the reason that they were so effective in controlling their pandemic is that they used this biosurveillance gear that if we saw it here, we would freak out. I mean, people ripping their masks off and punching Walmart managers over masks. If they saw cops coming to them they had these glasses that could identify somebody's history and could tell. They had drones taking people's temperature. You couldn't leave your house without checking in and out with your phone. They knew where everyone was. All of this technology is available, and they were using it and applying it to their population. So it really is a very futuristic kind of dystopian place. Not saying that we are doing surveillance capitalism, where every single, every man, woman, and child in America has 50,000 data points for sale every year, and from Snowden, that the national security state can dip into that stream whenever they want to. We're just as surveilled in a different way. But in America, it's rip the mask off. I want liberation. Nobody's even talking about this other aspect.
Well,
that's
surveillance is a big issue. It's another day. We'll do that.
That's another
certainly
story.
the passports are beginning to show their face here, and that's going to be a big issue. Nick Petrovsky from Flinders University in Adelaide. I want to thank you so much for your persistence in doing this research and sticking with it. It takes a lot. It takes a lot to resist the efforts of the entire scientific community, and I gather journal after journal which turned you down for whatever reason, and still to this day I was still questioning it. But it seems like it's not only thorough but actually the most accurate of all the attempts to identify what the origin of the virus was. So thank you so much for sticking with that. That's an incredible testament to who you are and your work.
It's a pleasure.
But thank you so much for being here, Nick, and have a good day in Australia.
It's a real pleasure. Yeah.
Okay.
Lovely
Cheers.
to meet
Thank
you,
you.
Nina and Noel.
Likewise.
Thanks, Zev.
Narativ is funded by viewers like you. Support our independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative.